Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. And today I want to make a soft pumpkin topiary, and I want the bottom of my topiary to be a knit pumpkin. So I did start with the knit pumpkin so I would know what size to make the other pumpkins. If you're an experienced knitter, you're going to find this pumpkin very easy to knit, but if you're a beginner, I think you can also knit this pumpkin if you want to. I'll give you step-by-step instructions, and I'll give suggestions for making it an easier knit if you want to start out a little bit simpler. If you don't want to knit a pumpkin at all, then I'll put chapters in so you can jump to the pumpkins which are made out of fabric. To knit this, I'm going to use this Lion brand respun, recycled polyester yarn. It's very thick and chunky, and the color is called Whipped Cream. And this suggests 9mm needles, so that's what I'm going to use. I'm also going to use a cabling needle. Now I am going to knit this in the round, and I'm going to use circular needles. I always knit on circular needles. I really like them. So I have 9mm circular needles here. You can certainly knit this flat and then join it together, just stitch it together when you're done if you want to. Now I'm going to cast on 72 stitches. If you want to knit a pumpkin similar to mine, the same pattern, but maybe a different size, then cast on some multiple of 6. So to start, I'm going to make a slip knot and slide that over one of the needles, and then I'm going to slide my other needle in and knit a stitch, but instead of pulling off, I take that and put it back on the original needle. And again, I'm going to cast on 72 stitches. I'm going to use the magic loop method here of knitting in the round, and I am so grateful to my good friend Sharon for teaching me this method. But I'm going to cast on 72 stitches and pay attention to where that gap is between stitch 36 and 37. You can count, or you could put a stitch marker on between those two stitches, because we are going to divide the stitches onto the two needles after we're done casting on. So you can see I have a stitch marker at the 36 mark. I have 36 stitches to the right of it and 36 stitches to the left. So half of my stitches are on each side of the stitch marker. And what I'm going to do is then divide my stitches onto the two needles, but hopefully not pulling apart too much where those two stitches are connected together. Okay, so now once we have it divided onto the two needles, we're going to use one needle to knit the stitches on the other needle. So the way you want to orient this is the knots of your stitches down, and if you used the knit cast on like I did, the tail is going to be on the needle that's closest to you, and the working yarn is going to be on the needle that's furthest from you. However you cast on, make sure the working yarn is on the needle that's furthest from you. And so we're going to pull that needle out of the stitches to give us some space to work with. And we're going to put the yarn over the back of the needle because we're going to knit. And then we're going to put it into the front needle and begin knitting. Now my pattern is going to be knit 4, purl 2, and repeat that all along the needles. Once you come to the end of the first needle, you're going to slide the unworked stitches onto the needle that was free, and you're going to slide the needle with the worked stitches out so that it's free so that you can now work with it, because that's where the yarn is. And again, make sure that you flip the yarn over the needle, and you're going to knit and just continue with the pattern. Once you've done both needles, that's one row. And you're just going to repeat swapping which needle has the stitches and which needle you're working with as you go around. Now, a couple of tips. My circular needles aren't very long, so sometimes the stitches got very close to each other at the middle. So I did put a stitch marker between the stitches just so I didn't have to figure out where one half began and the other half ended. When you're starting when you're starting a new needle, you want to pull those first two stitches very tight. So knit the stitch, then pull it very tight so you don't end up with a ladder or a gap whenever you stitch between the two needles. And finally, if you're like me and you knit while you're watching TV or doing something else, in order to keep track of when you've completed one full row, pay attention to where that tail is from when you cast on. So for me, the tail is where I started knitting. So if I have the tail to the right, then I've just completed one row. Now to cable, what I did was I knit 4 complete rows, and then for each set of knitting, so for each 4 stitches that were knit, I took the first 2, and put them onto the cabling needle and held them to the front of the work while I knit the second 2, and then I knit the first 2 off the cabling needle. Then purl 2, and then repeat again. We've reached the knit stitches, take 2 onto the cabling needle, bring them to the front of the work, knit the second 2, and then knit the first 2 off the cabling needle. So then after that, I would do 3 complete rows, and then the same cabling, cable 2 to the front. And I did that for 7 sets of cables. So I did 4 at first because that's going to be the bottom of the pumpkin, and I thought we could use a little bit more plain knitting before we got to the cabling at the bottom. But then after that, 3 complete rows, then a cable row, 3 complete rows, then a cable row. And do that until you have a pumpkin that's the height that you want, remembering that you're going to gather at the top and the bottom, so part of what you knit is going to be the top and the bottom of the pumpkin and not the height. So again, I did 7 cabled rows. I did 32 total rows because I did 3 plain rows after my last cable, and I could have done a little bit more just like I did at the bottom, but I did 3. So once I was happy with the height of my pumpkin, I did not see a reason to bind off. You could certainly bind off if you want to, but we're going to be gathering the top. So what I did was I cut a long enough piece of yarn for me to put it through all of those top stitches, put it onto a yarn needle, and then just starting with the last stitch that I knit, I slipped the needle through the stitches and slipped them off of the knitting needles. Now, because that's going to be the top, I don't want to gather that yet. I want to stuff the pumpkin from the top down. So now I'm going to gather up the bottom. So the first thing I did was I did weave in that tail from when I cast the stitches on. And then I took some yarn on the yarn needle and I just threaded it through those cast on stitches, like maybe every 2 or 3 stitches I threaded it through. And then I just pulled it tight and I tied a square knot in the bottom. Now, originally I thought I wanted some weight in this pumpkin, so I took an old salsa jar and filled it with sand. I took an old salsa jar, I washed it out really well, and I filled it with sand, and then I put fiber fill around it. And I'm using fiber fill here because this is white, and I don't want anything I put inside to show through, but you know I do save all of my sewing scraps, so sometimes I will use those for stuffing something. But in this case, I'm using fiber fill. But I ended up taking that jar out because I'm going to need to sew my pumpkins together, for one, and for another, I didn't like the height that it gave this pumpkin. I realized I want this pumpkin to be more squished, so I did not keep that in. You don't need to do that step. Oh, I did say if you wanted to do a simpler knit here, you don't need to do the cabling. I would recommend doing a pattern of knit and purl, though, so that you have natural marks on the pumpkin that you can use to put some yarn through it and pull it to give it a little bit more of a pumpkin shape. So here I'm just demonstrating how you could take that yarn and pull it through the purled areas to give your pumpkin some shape. And I am going to do that with the sewn pumpkins, but I did not do it with the knit pumpkin because I felt the cables gave it enough of a pumpkin look. So then I measured the circumference of this pumpkin, and it is 25 inches. And I was using that to figure out about what size do I want to make the next pumpkin that I'm going to stack on top. And I decided I wanted a pumpkin with a 16-inch circumference. Now, so I used the same method to create a pattern for a piece that I could use to make a sphere. This method is from Sorokina, and I will link that video again. But my compass is not large enough to make a pattern piece for a pumpkin with a 16-inch diameter. So what I did was I made a pattern piece that was half size, and then I enlarged it on my photocopier. So I doubled the size of my photocopier. And one difference between this and what I did when I made the Hocus Pocus balls is I did put a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this pattern when I made it. So now that I have the pattern, I'm going to make the second pumpkin out of these old pajamas, which belonged to one of my kids, and somebody had already cut a leg off of these, so they have been sacrificed already. They were falling apart. And this is a very sort of thin fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just cut the seam up this leg. But then I'm going to iron some interfacing onto this, just so that it doesn't fray while I'm working with it. And interfacing that I'm ironing on, it's actually double-sided fusible interfacing, so it's a little bit sticky. But I happen to have a lot of it, and it's not that good for many of my projects, so I figure I'll use it up here, but ideally it would have been a single-sided fusible interfacing. And so once I had ironed that interfacing on, I just started cutting out the pattern pieces, and I made pattern pieces a size that I will need 8 to create a pumpkin. And I do think 8 is a good number for a pumpkin, but the actual reason that I chose that is because when you're making the pattern piece, you divide your circumference by the number of pieces that you want, and 16 divides evenly by 8. So it just made making the pattern easier too. And when I did this, because these pajamas are a plaid, I made sure that each piece was going to line up, the plaid pattern was going to line up around the pumpkin when I sewed it together. So now with those all cut out, I'm just going to sew them together, right sides together. So I'm going to take 2, I'm going to clip them together, and sew a 1/4 inch seam top to bottom. Then I'm going to take the next one, clip it to one of those right sides together, and sew the seam top to bottom. And I did that all the way around. Now with the other pumpkin, I did a slightly different method that I think is easier, especially for the other pumpkin, which is a heavier fabric. Once I had sewn all the way around, I sewed halfway or 2/3 of the way up the last 2 pieces to close the pumpkin up, but leave an opening at the top for turning and stuffing. So then I just stuffed that with some leftover fabric pieces, threads, and some fiber fill. Once that was all stuffed, I hand stitched the opening closed. And then to give it more of a pumpkin-y shape, I used some blue yarn and a large yarn needle, and I poked that up through the pumpkin so that, first of all, I could sort of squish it down some, but then I just went over the seams with the yarn, pulling it tight, and then twisting it or slipping it under where it was in the middle, and then going around another seam and then slipping it under so it ends up with a sort of spoke in the middle where the yarn is slipped around itself. And then I just tied a knot at the bottom. And then once I had done that, I had left a slight opening in the bottom where I could still poke some stuffing in and reshape that pumpkin to get it to be nice and full between where the bits of yarn were. Now, for the last pumpkin, I decided to just scale down that pattern piece 80%. So instead of trying to figure out what circumference I wanted and making a new pattern piece, I thought, let me work with the one I have, scale it on my copier. So I did just scale that down 80%. And I have this green, almost a velvety fabric, but it's a very heavy fabric, has a very heavy back, so I think it might be upholstery fabric that I got at JoAnn's, and I got 1/8 of a yard. So it was about, 60 or 80 cents for this piece of fabric. And so I'm just going to cut my pattern pieces out of this. But to sew these pieces together, especially because it's so heavy. First of all, I am using a walking foot because it's so heavy. But what I decided to do was sew them together in pairs. So I ended up with 4 pairs, right sides together, and then I sewed 2 pairs together and 2 pairs together. So I ended up with 2 halves, and then I sewed the 2 halves together and then about 2/3 of the way up on the last half. This ended up being much easier, and I think that my seams were better sewing it this way. So with this pumpkin, I did the same thing that I did with the blue one. This time I used a dark green yarn and went around the pumpkin, putting the yarn in the seams and pulling it tight and filling in stuffing. Now for a stem for the pumpkin, originally I thought I would use a stick from my yard or something, but I decided that that just looked too rustic for this pumpkin. So I'm going to use some cinnamon sticks. And I think that gluing these together gives it a sort of a pumpkin stem look. So I'm going to use 5 cinnamon sticks, some fat ones and then some smaller ones, and I'm just gluing them together with hot glue. And then regretting that I sewed up the top of this green pumpkin so well, because I did have to cut some of those stitches to slip this in. It might have been better to put this in first before I did the green yarn, because I did have to kind of skew it to the side a little bit because of that green yarn. And then I think these maple leaves from the Dollar Tree really look like pumpkin leaves, or they're similar enough that I'm going to use them, and these are white and I have ironed them. And I'm just going to cut off a couple of these and stick them in that same hole where the stem is. Now to hold my whole pumpkin stack together, I'm going to take some green yarn, tie it to the green yarn at the top, thread it through all 3 of the pumpkins, and then at the bottom, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this little wood round that I have. I had cut these last year as gift tags, and I'm going to drill a hole in the middle of it and then put my yarn through that. I think you could use a large button here, or you could use anything. You could probably use another cinnamon stick. I just want something to hold that tight. And then I filled in the hole with hot glue and then tied a knot in the yarn and snipped the yarn. And here's the topiary. What do you think? What do you think of the colors? Please tell me in the comments. I did struggle with the colors a little, so I'd love to know your thoughts. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.